Hey there, you're listening to a special edition of the Smoke Meat Podcast. I'm your host, Brad Pittman. Smoke Meat's brought to you by Joe's Underground at the corner of 8th and Broad in Augusta, Georgia, in the bottom of the Lamar Building. Such a wonderful place. They make you feel like family every time you go in. They support their community. They support each other, and they help support you. So let's do them a favor and help support them at Joe's Underground at the corner of 8th and Broad in Augusta, Georgia, in the bottom of the Lamar Building. Remember, I goes to Joe's and so should you. Today is 9/11. Well, tonight is. Normally, I stay away from anything 9/11 related. I just have my reasons. But tonight, you know what? I got to thinking about a way that I can kind of pay tribute and just kind of make it very personal, because it is personal for me. You know, I remember where I was. I was working at headquarters at Thompson Fire Department, and I was outside washing my fire engine in that morning, and you know, we couldn't have the TV on during the day at all, period. That would get you written up and possibly sent home. And our secretary came out and said, a plane just hit the World Trade Center, you know. And I'm like, well, that sucks, you know, because you just think, okay, somebody can't fly or whatever. You know, when I was concerned, I'm like, man, that's horrible. And then my lieutenant came out and said, a second one just hit, we're under attack. And we went in and turned on the TV and we watched. And we stood there, all of us just jaws on the ground, you know, just and watched as all these people died. And it was a horrible thing, one of the most horrible things in the world. And no one knew what was happening, no one knew what was coming next. You know, and here all of a sudden we were in the breach. We were those guys, and we didn't know what was going to happen. You know, we had an uneventful day because everybody else was in shock too. But just the way that it made me feel, and the way it makes me feel every year, you know, to know that these people died, you know, doing what we do. You know, nobody's promised the next second. You know, I may not finish this recording. So, you know, right now in all these times of trouble and everybody disagreeing and hating each other, and, you know, look around you and just understand everybody here is human. You know, it doesn't matter what color you are, who you love, you know, what religion you are. It is what it is. You know, everybody's going to be different. And we need to understand that. We need to just figure out, even though we're all different, we are all the same. You know, it wasn't just white people that ran into the building. It wasn't just straight people that ran into the building. It wasn't just Southern Baptists that ran into the building. You know, it wasn't just native-born Americans that ran in there. It was people. And we need to remember that. And the best way that I figured out to be able to kind of honor their memories is, you know, I've seen the stickers, all of them, you know, have the 343 and all that, which is awesome. But, you know, years ago, I had a website, and I typed out all the names one by one. I didn't cut and paste anything. And that made it hit home, you know, because each name I was typing, that was a dad, a brother, a sister, a mother, a father. You know, just somebody loved them. And that made it personal, and that made it hit home. So tonight, you know, there's not going to be any jokes. There's not going to be any interviews. There's just going to be me reading the names of 343 people who went to work and never got to come home. The voice may break some. Might even hear me cry a little bit. I don't know. I'm kind of misty right now. But we're going to get through this. And, you know, I know everybody doesn't always listen all the way to the end of my shows, which is cool. But I'm begging you to please listen all the way to the end of this and help honor these people. And remember their sacrifice. And remember, you know, people aren't heroes one day a year. You know, it's always everybody, you know, we all go into work doing what we have to do, not knowing if we're coming home. So y'all just remember that. And without further ado, here we go. I'm going to get this thing started. Y'all make sure y'all share it and send this thing out, make it go viral. Thanks. And if I mispronounce a name, I really don't mean to. But here we go. Chief Peter Gansey Jr., Commissioner William M. Feehan, Fire Marshal Ronald Paul Bucka, Chaplain Michael Judge, Chief Gerard Barbara, Chief Donald Burns, Chief Matthew Lancelot Ryan, Lieutenant Paul Thomas Mitchell, Chief William McGovern, Chief Richard Prunty, Faustino Apostol Jr., Lieutenant Thomas O'Hagan, Chief John P. Williamson, Chief Orion Palmer, Lieutenant Stephen G. Harrell, Lieutenant Philip Scott Petty, Chief Thomas Patrick DeAngelis, Thomas McCann, Chief Dennis Lawrence Devlin, Chief Edward F. Garrity, Lieutenant Charles William Garbarini, Carl Asaro, Alan D. Feinberg, Chief John M. Paolilio, Chief Frederick Claude Scaffold III Jr., Lieutenant Charles Joseph Margiotta, Lieutenant Jeffrey E. Guha, Lieutenant Anthony Jovic, Chief Joseph Grzeliak, Michael Leopoldo Bocchino, Chief John Moran, Chief Lawrence T. Stack, Chief Dennis Cross, Chief Joseph Ross Marchbanks Jr., Captain Joseph D. Farrelly, Captain Thomas Moody, Captain Timothy M. Stackpole, Chief Thomas Theodore Haskell Jr., Captain Martin J. Egan Jr., Captain William O'Keefe, Lieutenant Andrew Desperito, Michael T. Weinberg, Calixto Anaya Jr., James C. Riches, Thomas G. Scholes, Paul A. Dechtmeyer, Manuel Del Val Jr., Paul Bayer, Thomas Holohan, William R. Johnston, Robert Barrow, Lieutenant Greg Arthur Atlas, Jeffrey James Olson, Paul Pansini, Captain William Francis Burke Jr., Thomas Anthony Casoria, Michael J. Alferis, Vincent D. Kane, Martin E. McWilliams, Robert McPadden, James Nicholas Papa George, Hector Luis Tirado Jr., Mark P. Whitford, Captain Thomas Farino, Dana R. Hannon, Robert W. Spear Jr., Lieutenant Kevin Pfeiffer, David Ark, Michael Boyle, Robert Evans, Keith Roy Marcellus Maynard, John Giordano, Lieutenant John F. Ginley, Kevin Bracken, Michael D. DeOria, Bruce Gary, Michael F. Lynch, Stephen Mercado, Paul John Gill, Jose Guadalupe, Leonard Regaglia, Christopher Santora, Lieutenant Peter L. Freund, Robert Lane, Christopher Mazzillo, Stephen P. Russell, Lieutenant Robert B. Nagel, Ruben D. Correa, Lieutenant Paul Richard Martini, Gregory Joseph Buck, Christopher Pickford, John Albert Shart, Lieutenant Robert Francis Wallace, Carl Henry Joseph, Sean Edward Powell, Kevin O. Riley, Lieutenant Carl John Bedegian, John Francis Florio, Michael Edward Roberts, Kenneth Thomas Watson, Daniel Sewer, Lieutenant Kenneth Phelan, Stephen Coakley, Neil Joseph Levy, John Chipura, David Paul DeRubio, Brian McAleese, Stanley S. Smagala Jr., Lieutenant Brian G. Ahern, Frank Bonomo, Michael Scott Carlo, Jeffrey Stark, Eugene Whelan, Edward James White III, Lieutenant Stephen Bates, Nicholas Paul Chiafalo, Francis Esposito, Lee S. Failing, Lawrence G. Vailing, Lieutenant Glenn E. Wilkinson, Ronnie Lee Henderson, Michael Ragusa, Anthony Rodriguez, Raymond R. York, Chief John Fanning, Lieutenant John A. Kriske, Dennis M. Carey, Martin N. DeMeo, Thomas Gardner, Jonathan R. Holman, Dennis Scasso, Kevin Joseph Smith, Captain Frederick Hill Jr., Michael J. Clark, George DePasquale, Dennis P. Germain, Daniel Edward Harlan, Carl Molinaro, Dennis Michael Mulligan, Captain Patrick J. Brown, Lieutenant Kevin W. Donnelly, Michael Carroll, James Raymond Coyle, Gerard Dewin, Jeffrey John Giordano, Joseph Maloney, John Kevin McAvoy, Thomas Patrick McSweeney, Joseph J. Ogren, Stephen John Olson, Captain David Terrence Woolley, Lieutenant Daniel O'Callahan, Joseph Angelini Jr., Peter Brennan, Michael E. Brennan, Michael Haub, Michael F. Lynch, Samuel Oitis, John James Tipping II, Lieutenant Vincent Francis Giamona, Lieutenant Michael Warchola, Louis Arena, Andrew Brunn, Thomas Hannafin, Paul Hanlon Keating, John A. Santori, Gregory Thomas Saucedo, Captain Vernon Allen Richard, George Kane, Robert Joseph Foti, Charles Mendez, Richard Muldowney Jr., Vincent Princiata, Lieutenant Vincent Gerard Halloran, Gerard Baptiste, John P. Tierney, Jeffrey P. Walls, Sean Patrick Talon, Lieutenant Michael Quilty, Michael F. Camerata, Edward James Day, John F. Heffernan, Richard John Kelly Jr., Robert King, Matthew Rogan, Angel L. Huarbe Jr., Michael D. Mullen, Captain Walter G. Hines, Thomas Hetzel, Dennis McHugh, Thomas E. Sabella, Gregory Stack, Lieutenant Gerard Levy, Richard Leonard Allen, Arthur Thaddeus Berry, Thomas W. Kelly, Scott Kopytko, Scott Larson, Donald E. Oleslager, Eric T. Olson, Lieutenant Raymond E. Murphy, Robert Caratolo, Captain John R. Fisher, John Patrick Burnside, James Michael Gray, Sean S. Hanley, David LaForge, Robert Thomas Linnane, Robert D. McMahon, Gerald T. Atwood, Gerard Duffy, Keith Glasgow, Joseph Henry, William E. Krukowski, Benjamin Suarez, Captain Daniel J. Brethel, Stephen Elliott Belson, Lieutenant Glenn C. Perry, Matthew Barnes, John Michael Collins, Kenneth Kumpel, Robert Menara, Joseph Ravelli, Paul G. Ruback, John Marshall, Captain Frank Callahan, James Andrew Giberson, Vincent S. Morello, Michael Otten, Michael Roberts, Joseph Spohr Jr., Peter Alexander Bielfeld, Lieutenant Joseph Gullickson, Patrick Byrne, Salvatore B. Calabro, Brian Cannizzaro, Thomas J. Kennedy, Joseph Maffio, Terrence A. McShane, Captain Vincent Brunton, Thomas Richard Kelly, Henry Alfred Miller, Dennis O. Berg, Frank Anthony Palumbo, Lieutenant Christopher P. Sullivan, Lieutenant Robert M. Regan, Joseph Agnello, Vernon Paul Cherry, Scott Matthew Davidson, Leon Smith Jr., Peter Anthony Vega, Christian Michael Otto Regenhard, Andrew Jordan, Michael Kiefer, Thomas Mingione, John T. Vigiano II, Sergio Villanueva, Michael Joseph Cawley, Captain Terrence S. Hatton, Lieutenant Dennis Mojica, John Angelini Sr., Gary Guidell, William Henry, Kenneth Joseph Marino, Michael Montesi, Gerard Terrence Nevins, Patrick J. O'Keefe, Brian Edward Sweeney, David M. Weiss, Lieutenant Peter C. Martin, William David Lake, Daniel F. Libretti, John Napolitano, Kevin O'Rourke, Lincoln Quape, Edward Rawl, Christopher Joseph Blackwell, Thomas Foley, Thomas Gambino Jr., Raymond Meisenheimer, Donald J. Regan, Gerard Patrick Schrang, Captain Brian Hickey, Lieutenant Kevin Dowdle, Terrence Patrick Farrell, William J. Mahoney, Peter Allen Nelson, Darrell V. Pearsall, Captain Louis Joseph Modafferi, Lieutenant Harvey Harrell, Lieutenant Joseph A. Muscali, John P. Bergen, Carl Vincent Beanie, Michael Curtis Fiore, Andre G. Fletcher, Douglas Charles Miller, Jeffrey Matthew Palazzo, Nicholas P. Rosamondo, Alan Tarasiewicz, Robert J. Crawford, Chief Raymond Matthew Downey, Chief Charles Casper, Captain Patrick J. Waters, Lieutenant Timothy Higgins, Lieutenant Michael Thomas Russo Sr., Captain James M. Amato, Lieutenant Edward A. Daatri, Lieutenant Michael Esposito, Lieutenant Michael N. Fodor, Brian Bilcher, Gary Box, Thomas M. Butler, Peter Carroll, Robert Cordice, David J. Fontana, Matthew David Garvey, Stephen Gerard Siller, Lieutenant William E. McGinn, Eric Allen, Andrew Fredericks, David Halderman, Timothy Haskell, Manuel Mojica, Lawrence Virgilio, Lieutenant Michael K. Healy, Thomas Patrick Cullen III, Robert Hamilton, Michael J. Lyons, Gregory Sikorsky, R. Bruce Van Hine, Terrell Coleman, Thomas Kouvikis, Peter J. Langone, Patrick Lyons, Kevin Pryor, Lieutenant Ronald T. Kerwin, Ronnie E. Geis, Joseph Hunter, Jonathan Lee Ielpi, Adam David Rand, Timothy Matthew Welty, Paramedic Carlos L. Lilo, Paramedic Ricardo J. Quinn, Superintendent Ferdinand V. Marone, Chief James A. Ramito, Lieutenant Robert D. Siri, Inspector Anthony P. Infante, Jr., Captain Kathy Nancy Mazza, Sergeant Robert M. Colfers, Donald James McIntyre, Walter Arthur McNeil, Joseph Michael Navas, James Nelson, Alphonse J. Niedermeyer, James Wendell Parham, Dominic A. Pizzulo, Antonio J. Rodriguez, Richard Rodriguez, Bruce Albert Reynolds, Christopher C. Amoroso, Maurice V. Berry, Clinton Davis Sr., Donald A. Foreman, Greg J. Froner, Uhuru Gunga Houston, George G. Howard, Thomas E. Gorman, Stephen Huxco Jr., Paul William Jurgens, Liam Callahan, Paul Lazinski, David Prudencio Lamagna, John Joseph Lennon Jr., John Dennis Levi, James Francis Lynch, John P. Scala, Walwyn W. Stewart Jr., Kenneth F. Teichen, Nathaniel Webb, Michael T. Holy, Sergeant Timothy A. Roy Sr., Sergeant John Gerard Coughlin, Sergeant Rodney C. Gillis, Sergeant Michael S. Curtin, Detective Joseph V. Vigiano, Detective Claude Daniel Richards, Maura Ann Smith, Ramon Suarez, Paul Talty, Santos Valentine Jr., Walter E. Weaver, Ronald Philip Klepfer, Thomas M. Langone, James Patrick Leahy, Brian Grady McDonald, John William Perry, Glenn Kieran Petit, John Dialera, Vincent Dans, Jerome M. P. Dominguez, Stephen P. Driscoll, Mark Joseph Ellis, Robert Fazio Jr., Keith Fairbairn, Richard Perlman, Mario Santoro, Yamel Marino, Mohammed Salman Harndani, Mark Sullins, Mark Schwartz, Jeff Simpson, Keith Roma. That was one of the most painful things that I have done in a long time. Each name was very personal. Always remember that somebody's family, somebody loved everybody on that list and still does. And always remember what they did. They went in and they did what they were supposed to do. They did their jobs, trying to bring order to the chaos and save their fellow man. Everybody just remember this, and don't honor emergency responders with cake and barbecue and hamburgers and all that. While we love it, the best way to honor us is to just be nice to each other. Can we all just try that? Thank you so much for listening. Y'all be sure to share this because I think everybody needs to hear it. God bless.